The Imperial Japanese Army marched into the Pacific War with absolute certainty of victory. Their soldiers had been conditioned to believe in their own invincibility, drilled relentlessly in the code of Bushido, and convinced that Western forces were fundamentally inferior. American troops, they were told, were soft men from a decadent society who valued comfort over sacrifice. The propaganda painted a picture of weak-willed soldiers who would crumble at the first sign of real combat. Japanese commanders assured their men that the Americans would flee when confronted with true warrior spirit. These assumptions would prove catastrophically wrong. When the 1st Marines stormed ashore at Guadalcanal in August 1942, the Japanese garrison was caught completely off guard. Not by the timing or the location, but by what came next. The ferocity of the American assault shattered every preconception the Japanese military had carefully constructed. These were not the soft, pampered men from propaganda posters. These were hardened fighters who moved with purpose and struck with devastating violence. The initial contact report sent back to Japanese command centers carried a tone of disbelief. Officers struggled to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been told to expect. The diaries recovered from fallen Japanese soldiers paint a stark picture of this psychological shock. One infantry private wrote about his first encounter with Marine forces in the jungle. He described men who fought with a savage determination that exceeded anything in his training. They did not retreat when fired upon. They did not hesitate when advancing under heavy fire. Instead, they pressed forward with mechanical precision, their weapons laying down fields of fire that seemed impossible to survive. The private noted that his entire squad had expected the Americans to break and run after the first volley. Instead, the Marines had charged directly into their positions. Another diary entry, this one from a sergeant who survived the early fighting, detailed the nightmarish experience of facing Marines in close-quarters jungle combat. He wrote about how the Americans seemed to materialize from the dense vegetation without warning. Their movement through the jungle was unnaturally quiet for such large men. When they attacked, it came with overwhelming firepower that left Japanese positions devastated in seconds. The sergeant described the sound of Browning automatic rifles as a mechanical roar that announced death itself. He wrote that his men, veterans of campaigns in China and Malaya, were genuinely frightened for the first time in their military careers. The psychological impact of Marine aggression cannot be overstated. Japanese military doctrine emphasized spirit over firepower, the belief that superior will could overcome material disadvantage. But the Marines brought both. They fought with an intensity that matched or exceeded Japanese fanaticism, while simultaneously deploying firepower that was orders of magnitude greater. This combination proved deeply unsettling to Japanese forces who had built their entire tactical philosophy around spiritual superiority. The realization that the enemy possessed equal fighting spirit plus vastly superior weapons created a crisis of confidence that rippled through imperial ranks. Night fighting became particularly traumatic for Japanese soldiers facing Marine units. The Imperial Army had developed effective night infiltration tactics that had worked brilliantly against Chinese and British forces. These tactics relied on surprise, close-quarters combat, and the psychological terror of darkness. But the Marines adapted with frightening speed. They established defensive perimeters that were nearly impossible to penetrate silently. Trip wires, interlocking fields of fire, and disciplined fire control turned Japanese night attacks into suicide missions. More disturbing to Japanese soldiers was the fact that Marines began launching their own night raids, turning the tables with devastating effect. One Japanese officer's journal, recovered after the battle for Henderson Field, provides chilling insight into the growing fear. He wrote about a night attack his company launched against a Marine position. They had moved silently through the jungle, confident in their approach. But as they closed to within 50 meters, the entire Marine line erupted simultaneously. Flares lit the sky, machine guns opened up with interlocking fire, and rifle fire came from positions the Japanese had not even detected. The officer described watching his men cut down in waves, unable to retreat or advance. He wrote that the Marines fought with a cold, calculated fury that was more terrifying than hot-blooded rage. They were not panicking. They were systematically destroying his unit. The introduction of flamethrowers added a new dimension of horror to Japanese accounts. Multiple diary entries reference these weapons with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. One soldier described seeing a Marine flamethrower team clear a bunker complex that had held off conventional attacks for hours. The psychological impact of the weapon was as devastating as its physical effects. Japanese soldiers who witnessed flamethrower attacks wrote about the primal terror it induced, how men would abandon fortified positions rather than face that particular death. The fact that Marines wielded these weapons with apparent ease, advancing under fire to get within range, only reinforced the image of them as unstoppable warriors. Japanese military records began to reflect a significant shift in tone as the Guadalcanal campaign dragged on. Early reports had been dismissive of American combat effectiveness. Later reports adopted a much more respectful, even fearful tone. Intelligence assessments started warning units about Marine tactics, their aggressive patrolling, their effective use of combined arms, and their refusal to yield ground once taken. One intelligence document specifically noted that Marine units displayed a level of small unit leadership and initiative that was unexpected in Western forces. Japanese planners had assumed that American troops would be helpless without constant officer supervision. Instead, Marine squads and fire teams operated with deadly independence. The discipline of Marine forces under fire particularly impressed and disturbed Japanese observers. Imperial doctrine taught that discipline came from unquestioning obedience and acceptance of death. But Marine discipline appeared to come from training, trust, and professional competence. Japanese officers noted that even when Marine units were surrounded or outnumbered, they maintained formation and continued to fight effectively. There was no mass panic, no collapse of order. Instead, Marines would establish defensive positions, call in supporting fire, and either hold out until relieved or fight their way out. This kind of tactical flexibility was alien to Japanese military thinking and deeply troubling to encounter in combat. Several high-ranking Japanese officers left written assessments that acknowledged the exceptional quality of Marine forces. One division commander wrote a report after his unit was mauled at the Tenara River. He stated bluntly that his men had underestimated the enemy and paid a terrible price. The Americans, he wrote, fought with a combination of individual courage and collective coordination that his forces could not match. He noted that Marine positions were well prepared, mutually supporting, and defended with a volume of fire that made frontal assaults suicidal. His recommendation was to avoid direct confrontation with Marine units whenever possible, advice that contradicted the entire Japanese military philosophy. The respect that developed was not admiration or affection. It was the recognition that predators give to other apex predators. Japanese soldiers came to view Marines as exceptionally dangerous enemies who could not be taken lightly or defeated through spiritual superiority alone. Diary entries from later in the campaign show this evolution clearly. Soldiers stopped writing about easy victories and started writing about survival. They described Marines as relentless hunters who gave no quarter and expected none. The jungle fighting had become a war of attrition that favored the side with better logistics, better firepower, and better training. On all three counts, the Marines held the advantage. The psychological warfare aspect also played a significant role. Marines developed a reputation for being slightly unhinged, willing to take risks that seemed irrational. Japanese soldiers wrote about Marines who would charge machine gun nests, who fought hand-to-hand with knives and entrenching tools, who refused to surrender even when badly wounded. This reputation was carefully cultivated and ruthlessly exploited. It created a psychological advantage that was as valuable as any weapon. Japanese soldiers began to dread facing Marine units, and that dread affected their combat effectiveness before the first shot was fired. One particularly revealing diary entry came from a Japanese soldier who survived multiple engagements with Marine forces. He wrote about the fundamental difference he perceived between the two armies. Japanese soldiers, he noted, were willing to die for the emperor and often sought death as a form of honor. But Marines, he observed, were determined to live and make the enemy die instead. This difference in mindset created a tactical asymmetry. Japanese forces would launch banzai charges that traded lives for minimal tactical gain. Marines would methodically destroy those charges with overwhelming firepower, then advance to take the objective. The mathematics of attrition favored the side that valued survival alongside victory. The logistical superiority of American forces also deeply impressed Japanese observers. Diaries frequently mentioned the seemingly endless supplies available to Marine units. Ammunition, food, medical supplies, and replacement equipment flowed to American positions in quantities that seemed impossible to Japanese soldiers who were often starving and down to their last bullets. This material abundance reinforced the sense that the war was unwinnable. How could spiritual strength overcome an enemy who never ran out of ammunition, who could call in artillery and air support at will, who evacuated their wounded and brought in fresh troops? As the campaign progressed and Japanese forces were gradually worn down, the diary entries became increasingly fatalistic. Soldiers wrote about facing Marines with a sense of doom. They knew the outcome was predetermined. The Americans would advance with their tanks, their flamethrowers, their endless ammunition. Japanese forces would fight with courage and determination, but courage alone could not stop what was coming. The psychological transformation was complete. The soft Americans of propaganda had become an implacable enemy that Japanese soldiers feared more than death itself. The ultimate testament to Marine effectiveness came in the final assessments written by surviving Japanese officers after Guadalcanal was lost. These reports, meant for high command, were brutally honest about what had gone wrong. They acknowledged that American Marines were not the weak, decadent soldiers they had expected. Instead, they were professional warriors who combined individual toughness with technological superiority and tactical flexibility. The reports recommended complete revision of tactics and strategy for fighting American forces. They warned that underestimating the Marines had cost Japan dearly and would continue to do so if attitudes did not change. The hidden diaries and official records reveal a progression from contempt to respect to fear. Japanese soldiers entered the war believing they faced inferior opponents. They left Guadalcanal, those who survived, knowing they had faced some of the finest combat troops in the world. The Marines had shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility through sheer combat effectiveness. They had proven that American forces could match Japanese aggression and exceed Japanese firepower. Most importantly, they had won the psychological battle, creating a reputation that would precede them throughout the rest of the Pacific War. The soft Americans had become the most formidable nightmare the Imperial Japanese Army would face.